Why is the most famous wonder of the ancient world the one that nobody has ever found? The Great Pyramid is still standing. The temple at Ephesus left foundations. The statue of Zeus at Olympia left a workshop with the sculptor's own cup in it. The Hanging Gardens of Babylon left nothing. No wall, no terrace, no pipe, no seed. Not one Babylonian tablet mentions them, and Babylon has been dug for over a century. The empire that is supposed to have built them lasted 87 years. In November of 626 BC, a man named Nabopolassar was crowned king in Babylon. He was a Chaldean from the marsh country in the south, and he was not supposed to be there. Babylon was not his to take. For 200 years it had belonged to Assyria, taxed and garrisoned from Nineveh, put down whenever it forgot which of the two cities was in charge. Assyria had been fighting itself for a decade. Two royal brothers had gone to war over the throne, and the empire had spent its strength on its own family. Nabopolassar took the opening. He declared Babylon independent, and then he did the part nobody expected. He went north. It took him 10 years to fight his way up the Tigris. 10 years of a subject king pushing at the empire that had owned his city for 2 centuries. Then, in 614 BC, he found an ally who wanted Assyria dead as badly as he did. The Medes came out of the mountains of what is now Iran. Nineveh was the largest city in the world, and it held a library of 30,000 tablets. In the summer of 612 BC, the Babylonians and the Medes surrounded it. The siege lasted 3 months. Then the walls came down, and the coalition burned the city so thoroughly that the ruin mound is still visible. The library burned with it, and the fire is the reason it survives. Clay bakes. The tablets hardened, the roof came down on top of them, and they sat under the rubble for 2,500 years. The empire that had held the Near East for 300 years was finished within 3, and the map it had drawn was suddenly nobody's. Egypt had watched Assyria fall and moved north to take what it could. An Egyptian army came up through the Levant and stopped at the Euphrates crossing, at a town called Carchemish. Nabopolassar was old by then and stayed in Babylon. He sent his son. At Carchemish in 605 BC, Nebuchadnezzar destroyed the Egyptian army. Not beat it, destroyed it. The survivors were run down as far as Hamath, and Egypt never came back over the Euphrates again. Everything Egypt had claimed between the river and the sea changed hands in a single campaigning season, and while he was still in the field, word reached him that his father was dead. He rode back to Babylon and was king within a month. He was about 30 years old. He would hold the throne for 43 years, which is half of everything the empire ever had. 4 years in, he went for Egypt itself. His own chronicle is unusually honest about how that went. Both sides took heavy losses, and he turned around and came home. He spent the next year replacing his chariots, and he never marched on Egypt again. It is the only time we know of that he lost, and it reads like the moment the rain changes shape. From here, he stops taking ground and starts spending everything he has on one city. Nebuchadnezzar inherited an empire he had not built. The map was Assyria's. The army was his father's. What he did with both of them was turn the money inward at one city for 4 decades. He was building on a reputation he had inherited. 1100 years before him, a king called Hammurabi had taken a middling town on the Euphrates and made it the center of Mesopotamia. And he is remembered for one object, a pillar of black stone taller than a man, carved top to bottom with 282 laws. What a surgeon may charge. What happens if a builder's house collapses on the owner? What a woman may keep if her husband puts her aside? Hammurabi's own empire fell apart within a century of his death. Scribes were still copying his laws 1,000 years later. The city kept the name long after it had lost the power, and Nebuchadnezzar meant to give it the power back. Babylon became the largest city on earth, something in the region of 200,000 people, the first place that is thought to have crossed that line. The Euphrates ran through the middle of it, with the old city on one bank and the new on the other, and a bridge between. The walls were wide enough to drive on. Greek visitors 200 years later could not describe them without sounding like liars. Of everything Nebuchadnezzar built, one piece can still be walked through. It is in Berlin. The Ishtar Gate was the northern entrance to the city, and the road that ran up to it was the processional way, walled on both sides. Both were faced in glazed brick, deep blue, with rows of animals raised out of the surface. Lions on the road, bulls and dragons on the gate. The color was not painted on, it was fired into the glaze, which is why a wall built around 575 BC still comes out of the ground blue. Paint would have been gone in a generation. The Babylonians were building for a god, and they built accordingly. The road led to the temple of Marduk, and behind the temple stood the thing the whole city was arranged around. Its name was Etemenanki. It was a ziggurat, a stepped tower, and it was dedicated to Marduk. The base was about 91 meters along each side. 7 tiers, a temple on the roof, and a stair up the front that a procession could climb. For anyone arriving from the west, this was the tallest thing they had ever stood next to. Merchants from the Levant, captives from Judah, Greeks later. When Greek and Hebrew writers described a tower in Babylon built to reach heaven, this is the building they had seen. Etemenanki is the structure behind the Tower of Babel, not a legend that turned out to be real. A real building that turned into a legend, which is the more interesting direction for that to run. None of this was decoration. Babylon was Marduk's city, and Marduk was the reason Babylon believed it was owed the world. In the Babylonian creation story, only Marduk will fight the sea, and the other gods hand him the kingship of heaven for it. A city whose god runs the universe does not think of itself as a province. And every spring at the New Year festival, the king had to walk into that temple, be stripped of his crown, be struck across the face by the high priest, and take the hand of Marduk. Only then was he king for another year. No hand, no kingship. It is worth remembering that, because in about 100 years a king of Babylon is going to decide he does not need to do it. Judah was a small kingdom on the road between Babylon and Egypt, which is the worst possible address. It had been paying Babylon since Carchemish. Then it stopped, gambled on Egyptian help, and the help did not come. Nebuchadnezzar took the city in 597 BC, replaced the king, and deported the court. 10 years later, Judah rebelled again. This time there was no replacement king. The siege ran about 18 months, and when the wall broke, Jerusalem was destroyed. The temple that Solomon had built was pulled down and burned, and the people who mattered were marched to Babylonia. That march is the Babylonian exile, and it changed the religion it carried. A people whose God had lived in one building on one hill now had no building and no hill. What they wrote in Babylonia is a large part of the Hebrew Bible. Some went home when Persia let them, 50 years later. Many did not. There was a Jewish community in Babylonia for the next 2,500 years. One place refused to fall. Tyre was a Phoenician trading city built on an island half a kilometer offshore, with a fleet. Nebuchadnezzar could beat any army in the Near East, and he could not walk on water. He besieged it for 13 years, longer than the empire would outlive him. In the end, Tyre came to terms rather than falling, which is a polite way of saying it did not fall. Which brings the story back to the thing that started it. Every Greek and Roman writer who lists the wonders puts a garden at Babylon. Terraces planted with full-grown trees, machinery lifting river water to the top. A king who built it, they say, for a wife from the mountains who could not bear the flatness of Mesopotamia. Babylon has been excavated since 1899. Nothing that could be a garden has ever been found. And there is a harder problem than that. Babylonian scribes recorded everything: grain, beer, wages, omens, the height of the river. Nebuchadnezzar left long inscriptions listing what he built, and he was not a modest man about it. The gardens are not in any of them. 300 miles north, and about a century earlier, there is a king who does describe one. Sennacherib of Assyria built a garden at Nineveh that he called a wonder for all peoples. He described it as a mountain made by hand, planted with trees from every country he had reached. He described bronze screws for raising water to the terraces. His grandson Ashurbanipal had a relief on his palace wall showing exactly that: a garden on rising ground, with an aqueduct running to it. Archaeologists have since dug up the aqueduct. Babylonian gardens were flat and watered by ditches. Assyrian gardens were built on artificial hills to look like mountains. The description in the Greek sources is of a mountain. The Oxford Assyriologist Stephanie Daly put the case together, and it is now the leading explanation. It is not proven, but the most likely answer to where the Hanging Gardens of Babylon were is that they were never in Babylon at all. They were in Nineveh, in the empire Babylon burned to the ground, and somewhere in the retelling, the wonder moved south to the more famous city. If a story that turns out to belong to somebody else is the kind of history that keeps you watching, subscribe. There is a whole series of these empires on the channel. There is one more story about Nebuchadnezzar, and it is a story rather than a record. The book of Daniel says he dreamed of a huge tree cut down, and then lived 7 years in the fields like an animal before his reason came back. No Babylonian source mentions it. It is why the name is famous outside archaeology, which is not the same as it having happened. The Babylonians did something no other empire in the region did. They went looking for their own history in the ground. Nebuchadnezzar's builders dug down through their own foundations to find the inscriptions of the kings who had built there before, read them, and put them back with new ones beside them. They revived Sumerian, which had been dead as a spoken language for over 1,000 years, and used old titles that had not been in use since Sargon of Akkad. An empire less than a century old was dressing itself as the heir of one that had died more than 1,000 years earlier. It is the behavior of a state that knows the world thinks of it as new. And while the kings built walls, the scribes were doing something that outlasted every wall in the empire. Babylonian astronomers watched the sky and wrote down what they saw, night after night, for centuries, until they had enough of a record to predict it. Eclipses, planets, the length of the year. They counted in 60s, not 10s. And that is why there are 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour, and 360 degrees in a circle. Every clock in the world is still keeping Babylonian time. Nebuchadnezzar died in October of 562 BC, after 43 years. His son was murdered within 2 years. The man who killed him ruled 4, died, and left it to a boy who lasted a matter of weeks before he was beaten to death by court officials. 4 kings in 6 years. The empire was intact on the map and rotten at the top. The man who came out of that was called Nabonidus, and he was not a soldier or a prince. His mother had been a priestess. He was interested in temples in the past, in restoring old sanctuaries and reading old inscriptions. And he preferred a different god. Nabonidus promoted Sin, the moon god, over Marduk. He rebuilt Sin's great temple at Haran. He put the crescent on his monuments. In a city where the king's right to rule came out of Marduk's own hand, once a year in public, the king started backing somebody else. Then he left. Nabonidus took an army into northwest Arabia, to an oasis called Tayma, and stayed there for about 10 years. The reasons are still argued over. Trade routes, incense, the moon cult, a plague at home, a fight with the priesthood he could not win. What is not argued over is the consequence. For a decade the New Year festival could not be held because the king was not there to take Marduk's hand. He left his son in charge, his name was Belshazzar, and he ran Babylon as regent while his father was in the desert. He is the king in the story of the writing on the wall, weighed in the balance and found wanting, which is where the phrase comes from. That is a story told about Babylon rather than a record from it. But the thing underneath it is true enough. Babylon was being run by a man who was not the king, on behalf of a king who would not come home. While Babylon argued with its own god, something had assembled to the east. Cyrus of Persia had taken Media, then Lydia, then everything between. By 539 BC, the only power left in front of him was Babylon. Nabonidus had come home by then, and the Babylonian army marched north to meet him. The two armies met at Opis on the Tigris in September. Opis is the only real battle in the fall of the Babylonian Empire, and it was over quickly. The Babylonian army was destroyed in the field, the city behind it was plundered, and its people were killed. Sippar, the next city up the river, surrendered a few days later without a fight at all. After Opis, there was nothing left between Cyrus and Babylon but the walls. And then Babylon, largest city in the world, with walls a chariot could turn on, and a garrison and a river through the middle of it. On the 12th of October, 539 BC, a Persian general walked into Babylon. There was no siege, there was no assault on the walls. Nobody had to climb anything or break anything. The gates were opened from the inside by people who lived there. The Babylonian Chronicle records it in the flattest language imaginable. The army entered Babylon without a battle. That is the whole of it. An empire of 87 years, the largest city on earth, and the tablet that reports its end does not even raise its voice. Cyrus arrived 17 days later and was welcomed. He went to Marduk's temple, took Marduk's hand, and did in public the thing Nabonidus had refused to do for 10 years. And that was the end of it. Not a wall breached, a priesthood that had been insulted for a decade, deciding that a foreign king who respected their god was a better proposition than their own king who did not. 87 years, from Nabopolassar's coronation to an open gate. There is one more thing worth saying about that ending, because of who recorded it. The two fullest accounts of the fall of Babylon are the Cyrus Cylinder and the Nabonidus Chronicle. The Cylinder is Cyrus explaining that Marduk chose him, that Nabonidus had offended the gods, and that the people welcomed him. The Chronicle is drier, and the better source. Both of them come out of the same Marduk priesthood that opened the gates. Almost everything known about why Babylon fell was written by the people who wanted it to fall. The priesthood got the ending it preferred, and then it got to write it down. Babylon was not destroyed, and its people were not swept away. It stayed one of the great cities of the Persian Empire, kept its temples, kept its scribes, and kept writing astronomy for another 400 years. Alexander took it without a fight 2 centuries later, meant to make it his capital, and died there in 323 BC. The walls are a low ridge in the desert south of Baghdad. The gate is in Berlin. The tower is a square depression full of water. And the garden that made the city famous is the one thing on the list that may never have been there. Babylon is remembered for a wonder it probably did not build, and forgotten for the one it did. Every hour anyone has ever measured, and every circle anyone has ever drawn, is counted in 60s because of scribes on a rooftop on the Euphrates, watching the sky and writing it down. If this was your kind of story, subscribe, and tell us in the comments which empire should be next.